Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling forgotten stories from British history. Now, if you've watched the film Zulu, you'll remember Henry Hook, whom Lieutenant Bromhead, played by young Michael Caine, describes as a thief, a coward and an insubordinate barrack room lawyer. Played by James Booth, this cockney anti-hero seems more intent on gaining a drop of medicinal brandy and gambling than doing any soldiering. Despite all this, Hookie does come good as he saves the patients in the hospital as it's stormed by the Zulus and is awarded Britain's highest medal for bravery, the Victoria Cross. It's one of cinema's great character arcs and in many respects it makes the film. But what if I told you that the real Henry Hook was the exact opposite of his film character? A teetotal model soldier who served his country for over 40 years. The film does this Victoria Cross hero a massive disservice. A disservice that caused great distress to his family at the premiere and led to yet another myth spawned by the film, as you're going to find out near the end. In the meantime, it's time to tell the true story of Henry Hook VC. Unlike the cockney character played by James Booth in the film, Alfred Henry Hook was born 100 miles from London in the Forest of Dean, Gloucestershire, on the 6th of August 1850. He was the eldest of 6 children, born to a farm labourer and his wife from the tiny hamlet of Churcham, about 6 miles west of Gloucester. In the 1861 census, he, like his father, was registered as a woodcutter, indicating that his education had already ended and he was out in the working world, aged 11. In 1870, just short of his 20th birthday, he married Comfort Jones, and they would have 3 children, a boy and 2 girls. He was already a volunteer with the Monmouthshire militia, and in March 1877 enlisted in the regular army, joining the 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot. Quite what motivated him to sign up is lost in the mists of history. Maybe he loved the army life that he'd discovered in the militia. Maybe it offered him better job security than his civilian role as a workman. Maybe his marriage wasn't as happy as intended. Maybe he simply wanted adventure. Who knows? But if it was adventure he was after, he was certainly going to get it in South Africa less than 2 years later. As an experienced militiaman, the 5'7" tall Hook only had to complete 3 months' training at the regiment's new depot in Brecon before he joined the regiment in Kent. The following year, his 2nd Battalion was sent to South Africa, where they fought in the 9th Xhosa War. In July 1878, they found themselves posted to the British colony of Natal, where tensions were rising with the neighbouring kingdom of the Zulus. When, in January 1879, Lord Chelmsford led a British invasion of Zululand, a small garrison of less than 140 men, mainly from B Company, 2nd Battalion, was left to guard the mission station at Rorke's Drift, on the British side of the border. The mission station had been converted into a supply depot and also a hospital. And inside the hospital were a small number of patients, some wounded in the early skirmishes with the Zulus, but most suffering from tropical diseases or accidents. Included in the number was Sergeant Robert Maxfield. From Monmouth, in the film, Maxfield is the NCO who accuses Hook of being a thief, and who previously put him on field punishment. That is artistic licence. Hook was no thief, and certainly hadn't been on field punishment. What the film does get right is that Maxfield was delirious from a combination of dysentery and rheumatic fever. And it was in this hospital that we find Henry Hook on the afternoon of the 22nd of January 1879. However, the reality in the film once more diverge at this point. In the film, Hook, played by James Booth, is malingering in the hospital, feigning injury so he doesn't have to do any soldiering. He suggests to Surgeon Reynolds that a spot of medicinal brandy will help the situation. However, Reynolds, who refers to him as my malingering Hector, tells him that brandy is for heroes, and simply lances a boil on his back instead. Let's face it, Zulu is a great film, it's still one of my favourites, but it does play fast and loose with the historical facts. Firstly, Hook was not malingering in the hospital. He was actually working as the cook and was preparing tea for the patients, when at around 3:30 in the afternoon, 2 breathless men rode into the mission station, bearing the news that the garrison at Isandlwana had been wiped out, and an army of 4,000 Zulus was heading for Rorke's Drift. Secondly, he certainly would not have been trying to sample any medicinal brandy, as back in August in Pietermaritzburg he had actually taken the pledge to abstain from alcohol with the Temperance Society of the Good Templars. From its beginnings in the 1850s, the Good Templars had grown rapidly in North America before its first lodge was established in England in 1868. By the time of the Anglo Zulu War, it had lodges throughout the British Empire. One of its most famous British members was William McGonagall, now often referred to at the time as Britain's worst poet. I've introduced you to some of his rhymes in previous episodes, such as my one on the Battle of Abu Klea during the Nile expedition to rescue General Charles Gordon in Khartoum. As the tiny garrison fortified the mission station, Hook was dispatched to defend the hospital. In the film, he shows a complete unwillingness to prepare for the fight, refusing to create any loopholes. He has a showdown with Sergeant Maxfield and afterwards laments that the sergeant had previously sentenced him to field punishment and sent his pay to his wife. No such showdown or punishment took place. In fact, before the battle, he actually received a good conduct payment rather than field punishment. Where the film Zulu and reality do come back together is during the actual Zulu attack. In the film, the rebel Hook comes good as he bravely defends the patients in the hospital and holds the Zulus off as the British retreat room by room. And that bit of the film is basically correct. Hook himself told his story on numerous occasions afterwards, and over the years it remained pretty consistent. Hook was one of just 6 able-bodied soldiers allocated to defend the hospital. Along with Private Cole, he was stationed in a room at the far left-hand side of the building. Now, when we talk about a hospital, it's easy to picture a modern hospital, or maybe one with those long wards at, say, Scutari in the Crimean War, or the military hospital at Netley on the Solent. Rorke's Drift was not like that. Here, the hospital had been converted from the missionary Dr. Otto Witt's house. A series of small rooms, some with high windows, some with external doors, some totally isolated, without even internal doors. The room that Hook and Cole were defending did at least have a door leading outside and another flimsy door leading into the next room. The former, leading outside, had been barricaded using heavy mealie bags, just as well as their room and the one next door, being defended by Private John Williams, bore the brunt of the Zulu attack. By the way, Williams had actually been born John Fielding, but had signed up as John Williams. Having dug loopholes through the wall, they prepared to hold their position. During the initial attack by the Zulus, Hook, who was considered a good marksman, claimed that he'd hit a warrior at 400 yards. He then spotted a Zulu hiding behind an anthill about 300 yards from the hospital. His first shot went high. His second hit the ground in front of the target. He was not sure if his third shot hit his opponent, but the Zulu never popped up again. Next day, he would go looking for that man, and you're going to find out what happened later in this story. For nearly 4 hours, they defended their tiny outpost. At some stage, Private Cole tried to make a break from the hospital, but was cut down by the Zulus. Now fighting alone, with his ammunition running low and the external door starting to give way to Zulu pressure, Hook retreated to the door connecting his room with the one next door, containing 6 patients. Hook slammed the flimsy internal door shut and began to barricade it with whatever was at hand. Behind him, the sole patient in his room, an African auxiliary, lay on his bed unable to move, calling for help. Hook heard the Zulus entering, shouting questions at the auxiliary, and then the terrible sounds of him being stabbed to death. He was now joined by Private John Williams, who had used a pickaxe to smash through the wall of the room he had been defending. The room in which they now found themselves, along with 6 patients, had no means of escape. There were no external doors, and the only internal ones led back to the rooms that they'd just vacated, which were now swarming with Zulus. Williams, still carrying his pickaxe, now started to smash a hole in the mud wall that led to the next room along, whilst Hook defended the doorway, killing at least 7 Zulus with both rifle fire and his bayonet. An assegai smashed into his helmet, forcing it back and gouging a wound across his head. At the time, the adrenaline numbed the pain, but in later life, Hook would suffer from painful headaches. More than once, the Zulus tried to grab the barrel of his gun, but he was able to pull it back and continue to fire. On one of those occasions, a strong Zulu warrior was attempting to wrest the rifle when Hook slipped a cartridge into the chamber and pulled the trigger. The muzzle was against the Zulu warrior's breast, and he fell dead. Hook added the dead Zulus to his barricade as Private Williams continued to smash an escape route. Finally, he broke through and the patients followed him. All the patients had now got through the hole, except one. Private John Connolly was 21 years old and had joined the army in 1876. During the initial British invasion of Zululand, he'd fallen from a wagon and dislocated his knee. He was in the hospital recovering, and Surgeon Reynolds had recently put his leg in a plaster cast. Now unable to move, he lay on his bed as his fellow patients fled through the hole. As Hook passed him, he pulled him from his bed as the Zulus broke into the room. Dragging him across the floor, he yanked him through the hole, breaking his leg again. But I guess the pain of having his leg broken again was the lesser of the two evils that he was being faced with at that moment. With the day turning to night, the Zulus, in a desperate attempt to smoke out these stubborn defenders, set the thatch of the hospital roof alight. Hook, Williams and their fleeing patients now found themselves in another room that was undefended. Apart from an external door, once more barricaded with mealie bags, they were trapped. As Hook later, and on more than one occasion, recalled, "We were pinned like rats in a hole." Yet again, Williams set to work, smashing a hole through yet another wall, whilst Hook killed any Zulu who tried to crawl through the hole which he had just pulled Connolly through. It's hard to imagine just how terrifying this ordeal must have been. Desperately fighting for your lives in a building that was thick with smoke, with flames crackling overhead, and at any minute the Zulus breaking into the tiny room, so small that Hook claimed that you couldn't swing a bayonet in it. Eventually they reached the last room, closest to the rest of the British garrison, and the fugitives were able to climb out of a high window and drop nearly 6 feet to the ground outside. However, they were not safe yet. During the battle around the hospital, the rest of the garrison had been so hard-pressed that the officer commanding, Lieutenant Chard, had ordered them to fall back to a new defensive line closer to the chapel-cum-storehouse. This not only left the hospital at the mercy of the Zulus, but now left the fugitives in no man's land. They now had to run the gauntlet of fire from Zulu marksmen, as well as the odd Zulu charging them as they raced to safety. As in the film, Hook brought up the rear. Now, in the film, Hookie breaks into the missionary's drinks cabinet, and whilst one of his comrades warns that it's a flogging offence, he helps himself to a swig of brandy. As you might have guessed, that is far from the truth for a man who had taken the pledge to abstain. Instead, Hook helped the injured Connolly out of the window and then carried him across his back to safety. Connolly would survive the battle and died in Swansea in 1906. For the rest of the night, Hook manned the barricades. He was one of a small team, led by Lieutenant Chard, that raced back across no man's land to retrieve a water cart for the parched garrison. The fighting that had raged so fiercely early in the evening eventually petered out around dawn. As the sun rose, and with no sign of the Zulus, Hook was tasked with gathering in any rifles or Zulu spears that he could find. He took the opportunity to go and see if he could find the man he'd been shooting at behind that anthill at the very start of the battle. He found him lying behind it, with a bullet wound through his forehead. It seems Hook was a much better shot than the film made out. It was whilst returning that Hook's story very nearly ended. He observed a tall Zulu warrior lying completely still, but bleeding from his ankle. In one of those moments that most of us have, when we know something isn't quite right but can't compute it, Hook thought it was strange that a dead man could still be bleeding. As he passed him, the warrior suddenly sprang onto his knees and tried to grab Hook's rifle. Hook gave him a blow with the rifle butt in his chest, and then, stepping back a yard or two, loaded his rifle and fired. After that, the defenders were not allowed to venture outside the mission station unless in twos or threes. It was the 23rd of January 1879, and as dawn turned into day, what remained of Lord Chelmsford's column approached out of Zululand, and seeing them, the Zulus, who had been considering another attack, withdrew. The Battle of Rorke's Drift was over. In the film, during the roll call, Hero Hook reverts to form and immediately tries to get back in the sick bay and do as little as possible, before Colour Sergeant Baum barks, "Stand where you are, Hook!" In reality, Henry Hook did revert to form, just a very different form. He went back to making tea for the men. And it was whilst he was making the tea, having thrown off his tunic and with his braces down, that he was told to report to Lord Chelmsford immediately. All in a fluster, he stood to attention in front of the commander, without his tunic, with his shirt sleeves rolled up, his braces hanging down, his hands and face black from smoke, and gave an account of his actions in the hospital. Despite his appearance, he must have made an impression on Chelmsford, because the commander stood up, shook his grubby hand, and congratulated him on his bravery. He also told Hook that if ever he wanted his assistance, he just had to ask. Hook would call in that offer just a few years later, as you're going to hear in a moment. Henry Hook was one of 11 defenders at Rorke's Drift to be awarded the Victoria Cross. He was also the only one to receive his medal at Rorke's Drift itself, when Chelmsford's successor, General Sir Garnet Wolseley, presented it to him in August of that year. He recalled that after the ceremony, many men offered him a drink, but, being true to his vow of abstinence, he refused. In fact, he took that pledge so seriously that he also refused his daily ration of rum, giving it to one of his comrades. After the war, Henry Hook bought himself out of the army and was discharged in June 1880. He applied to work as a janitor or assistant at the British Museum in London. However, he ran into a problem. He couldn't read, a key requirement for anyone working there. It was now that he called in that favour from Lord Chelmsford. Chelmsford, true to his word, wrote a letter supporting his application, which was joined by letters from his company commanding officer at Rorke's Drift, Lieutenant Brummett, and one from the Prince of Wales. These letters, and possibly his Victoria Cross, did the trick. On the 26th of December, 1880, he started his new job as duster of books in the museum's famous round reading room. He was to work at the British Museum for the next 24 years, eventually becoming a caretaker for members' umbrellas. And in that capacity, and wearing his Victoria Cross, he became a minor celebrity, and visitors would stop by to hear his stories of the battle. Despite taking lessons, he never became proficient at either reading or writing. Despite leaving the regular army, which cost him £18 at the time, it didn't take long for Henry Hook VC to once more join a volunteer battalion. In this instance, seeing as he was now living in London, it was the 17th North Middlesex Rifle Volunteers, where he was promoted to Lance Corporal. Shortly afterwards, he moved to the 1st Volunteer Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. As an aside, this unit had been formed in 1859 by Thomas Hughes, the author of Tom Brown's School Days, the book in which we first meet prize cad Harry Flashman. Hook would serve in the Volunteers for 20 years and rise to the rank of Instruction Sergeant. I said earlier that maybe one of the reasons that he had joined the army, and we don't know for sure, was because his marriage was already on the rocks in the 1870s. Certainly, when he returned from South Africa, he doesn't seem to have lived at the family home, and as we've just seen, within months he was working in London. Despite stories that his wife, Comfort, believed he'd actually been killed in the Zulu War and had married another man, the facts don't bear that out, or rather, not immediately. Comfort eventually did remarry, bigamously, but only in 1895. And at that point, Hook petitioned for a divorce, which was granted. In 1897, he married Ada Taylor at St Andrew's Church in Thornhill Square, Islington. The couple, plus a daughter, Victoria Catherine, were living in Lower Holloway, Islington in the 1901 census. Interestingly, his daughter, Catherine Victoria's initials, were VC Hook. Coincidence? Pride? Or a hidden sense of humour? I guess we'll never know. However, his health was never the same after Rorke's Drift. That assegai wound to his scalp gave him increasing discomfort as the years went by, and after his return to England, he suffered breathing problems and consumption, or what we'd now call tuberculosis. Dusting all the books in the British Museum probably didn't help matters, nor did the London smogs of the late 19th century. Eventually, his doctor advised him to seek the fresher air of the countryside, and so on the 1st of January 1905, he retired to his native Gloucestershire. He moved into 2 Osborne villas in Rosebery Avenue, Gloucester. Rosebery Avenue is still there, although Osborne villas have been demolished. His retirement would not be a long or happy one. His lungs were giving up, and on the 12th of March that year, Henry Hook VC died from tuberculosis. He was just 54 years old. Thousands lined the route of his funeral cortege, as it made its way from his house on the 6-mile journey to the parish church at Churcham, where he'd been baptised. The hearse was flanked by detachments from the South Wales Borderers, formerly the 24th Regiment of Foot, and the 1st Volunteer Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. And there in the churchyard of St Andrew's Church, in the tiny hamlet, his life came full circle as he was laid to rest. Hardly surprising, based upon what you now know about the real Henry Hook VC, his family were not happy about the way he was portrayed in Zulu. The film Zulu has created many myths about the battle, such as the Zulus saluting the defenders at the end, and the British garrison being full of Welshmen who sang Men of Harlech. It also spawned a myth about Henry Hook's family at the film's premiere. You might have heard the following tale and believed it. I certainly did, until I started researching the subject in more detail. The story that's common currency is that his daughters, who were attending the premiere, were so upset by the way their father was portrayed in the film that they stormed out. Unfortunately, there is not a single contemporary newspaper article reporting this incident. Nor have historians such as Ian Knight and Neil Thornton found any evidence in their research. But whilst not storming out, they were certainly upset about how Hook had been portrayed, and based upon what I've told you in this story, you can see why. One of them even wrote to James Booth, pointing out how inaccurately he'd played the role, and sent him a copy of a photograph of her father in old age. In fairness, Booth displayed it in his house until his own death in 2005. A nod to a man whom Zulu did a disservice to, but who served his country with gallantry. And now that you know the real story, if ever you visit Gloucestershire, why not take a detour to the quiet graveyard in Churcham, like I did a couple of years ago, to pay your respects to this humble Victorian hero, Alfred Henry Hook VC, 1850 to 1905. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed that story. Check out all my other episodes about the Anglo Zulu War. Thanks to all my patrons and supporters, and details as to how you can support my work are in the description below. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.